This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And David's not well today, so I'm on my own. But it's a pretty exciting day. I've just been to Prairie State Conservation Coalition meetings, and that's always rather wonderful. So I'll try and list some of the things that are happening there. But first I want to say that there's a memorial service to Dick Bishop, who was a strong supporter of Sierra Club. It will be at Homer Lake between 1 and 3 o'clock this afternoon. The Homer Lake Visitor Center back over the bridge. And Dick was a mathematics professor of note, and his Sierra Club involvement was one of his avocations. Back to the Prairie State Conservation Coalition. I missed the first day because I had other things happening and important things, but I am a regular attender. And so I understand the meeting. The first day is usually a combination of a meeting for the Prairie State Conservation Coalition itself, the institution of new members as the membership rolls over, a report by David Holman, who has a 64-page report, which is really excellent, with a little bit of vernacular included, so you don't get bored by looking at all the maps he has. They're bigger than thumbnail maps, but he outlines every inch of what has been acquired by associate groups. And these associate groups often have multiple agencies involved, so this is not necessarily only the PSCC, but it's information that's known to PSCC members, and it's the sort of thing we ought to know about. And if there's a report for a certain place, then the other groups will be included in the documentation. Excellent report, and it's the sort of thing that you can read and get an idea of what's going on in the state. Jennifer Wally was there. She's the CEO of the Illinois Environmental Council, and she usually gives an excellent report on what's happening in the legislative world. The Natural Heritage Chief of the Department of Natural Resources gave some update on the Stewardship Act. The Stewardship Act has been something that the Prairie States Conservation Coalition has been driving at for a long time, and Fran Hardy from the Nature Conservancy has also been right in there. So she was reporting on some of the Act has assigned finance to stewardship groups that are largely volunteer and don't have any support money. So 501c3 agencies that have a need can request finance. All the rules of the game are not quite sorted out yet, but they're in action, and I think the PSCC should be rather proud of their involvement in that. Some of these issues are broader than just regions or states. So there's usually some report, in this case from the Land Trust Alliance, from groups that are somewhat national in style, but yet very supportive of local efforts like Prairie State Conservation Coalition. I'll run through some of the themes. One was communications. Brendan Hayes from the Bold Bison Communication Group was dealing with diversity and equity and inclusion of conservation in multiple environments. I have to note that there were very few minority groups at this meeting. It was probably the best part of 100 people. And no black people. Sometimes a black administrator will be assigned to speak, but it's very difficult to know how to include minority groups in the somewhat more esoteric preservation of the landscape. We hope that they will improve. But he was talking about equity and diversity in conservation. There's a group that's evolving, which is called the Friends of Illinois Nature Preserves, and it was being circulated. It's almost a legal document that was being circulated, so it has numbers for each line and clause. But it's a draft proposal to bring together people who would support and Department of Natural Resources, which has been rather poorly funded. So the attempt will be to bring funding to that group and also to facilitate partnerships and volunteerism and to educate people about nature preserves. There's been a lot of developments in Illinois that are have been helpful and recently unique. The Nature Preserves Commission was put together in about 1963, and it has been innovative in documenting nature preserves within Illinois, and the principle has gone to other states and other countries. They're not only dedications for nature, but there are also easements and various arrangements. There's a land and water reserves that are various stages of sophistication of diversity and accessibility and a number of alternatives. So there's a list of people whom we largely know who could be advisors and consultants to this group. So this is something that's underway at the moment, but many of the people whose names are on this list are environmental and natural area people. the theme of stewardship evolved with the discussion of GIS and how GIS might be used in the work of conservation. Indeed, the internet has helped us to put a lot of things together that we could not put together otherwise. Farm conservation was another theme. And soil health is of concern. It's gotten to be that even very small amounts of hormonal stimulants could have a strong effect on people's biology. There's often purification of water does not catch these small amounts. I'm familiar with micronutrients like molybdenum and zinc and copper that even in very small amounts can change the biology. So soil is a very, very complex ecosystem. You take a spoonful of it and it's got a million microbes and bacteria and fungi and occasional paramecium or others. And so we need to be looking at that. At the extreme of this, we have dicamba, which is a herbicide that can be sprayed on soybeans that are resistant to it, but the broadleaf weeds around them succumb. But that dicamba is very, very volatile. It dries and blows into other people's farms and into natural areas. So that is something that has to be watched. Lisa Hadline from McHenry County was speaking about farmland projections and trying to preserve farmland. McHenry County is interesting. It's to the northwest of Chicago, and it does a lot of this sort of work. One of the retirees from the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission, Steve Byers, was speaking, and he has dedicated his life to the dedication of natural areas, and he will be retiring, and I'm sure he'll be very busy with specific things that he would like to do with his life, but he has been a world beater as far as preserving natural areas. There were wetland initiatives, and that appeared several times. Wetlands have been invaded by agriculture. You put up a levee and work the field behind. If water comes in from the locals, local creeks and the like, you use a pump to pump the water out, and you in effect raise the level of the river, but you can work the bottomlands. Not an awfully valuable plot of land in terms of the river process. It enabled cities, villages to locate in low positions. And when you have exceptional rains and climate change and very heavy rains, you have those floodplains are covered, even though there may be a a levee there to stop the flood. It's covered over, and those wetlands are gradually going back to not to agriculture but to nature, and that's topic comes up. Toolboxes. Kerry Nelson is a person who has put her life to fundraising. She was talking about philanthropy, and she's now located with Habitat for Humanity, but her energy is serious, and she has a sense of humor about this. There are agencies like Cancer and Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts and people.
There are bodies that are very well known, and they can fundraise very formally. But most of our natural areas are covered by people who are in small-time fundraising areas. And she was quick to point out that very seldom do individual fundraising efforts bring in a lot of money. One of the things you need to concentrate on is letting the public know what you're doing. What are the advantages of your particular natural area? Tell stories about the people involved. Not so much what we do, but how we do it. And that sort of information gets to the public, and you hope that some of that meets with philanthropists that are watching what you do. If you don't tell them what you do and how you do it, and you have to know that it may take 10 or 15 years for a philanthropist to decide to give you support money. And that support money might be rather huge. So there's a need to be out there letting people know what you do, but how you do it with people and how philanthropists can contribute. It is not simple. People who have money want to decide how to do what they're contributing to. And so very gently, and with a great deal of care, you have to work with people and explain why you want to do this but not that, and that may take many years also. Sometimes it's a matter of raising awareness. Lisa Howdeline, who has a lot to do with McHenry County, they have an oak need. They're in Savannah, and oak trees were part of it, but development has moved in. So then you have a plea with all the householders to take care of their heritage trees. Don't cultivate around the bottom of them. Don't compact the soil on top of them. It's a very famous situation in England, I think it is, where a storm took out a whole bunch of trees, and the one tree was lifted up and dropped back down. And that disturbance was enough to save its soul. So now people are warned not to compact the soil around the tree. do you put mulch around the tree? How does the tree interact with power lines and the like? But generally speaking, if you have 100 people more aware of the value of their oak savanna woodland and that they own one or two trees, then that's a plus. Jeff Warp from TNC, to the Nature Conservancy, independent, very famous conservation group, started by George Fell and continued with chapters everywhere. And so Jeff Walk is a specialist in lowland conservation, and we speak again of the levees and taking the nature back to those areas to not only control nitrogen and phosphate and other chemicals where there's a tendency to think if 1 pound per acre is valuable, then 2 pounds per acre might be even better. But unfortunately, the soil cannot contain that extra chemical. So educating agriculture is a serious challenge. But then there are also the micronutrients that we spoke of before, that sort of filtered out some by bottomland natural areas. And it's become so important that it's an advantage to conservation people to be a part of the restoration of these areas. There's one large area over by Havana near to Indian activities, and it's just come back from corn and soybeans, and the creatures are beginning to be biodiverse, and we could do more in that. These are people who are sort of suggesting ways and means of encouraging your own particular natural area or natural group. Joe Davies County is interesting. It's over on the northwest corner of Illinois. It is a retreat to some extent for Chicago people. Some of it is unglaciated, but it's not affected by glaciation. The water that was held back in Wisconsin eventually broke loose and went through the unglaciated areas and cut canyons. And so Joe Davies County becomes rather interesting. And there was a report there that related how they do this, how they inspire a small site to be a fundraising site, and are surprised when people come up with enough money to preserve associated sites. And that momentum has been observed in Joe Davies County especially. Looking at my notes here. The last speaker was interested in acronyms. He went through all the internet acronyms and the natural history acronyms, and it was kind of fun. But part we have to know about these names and agencies, and the internet has taught us a lot, but we have a lot to learn, and he was using that as a comic relief. I stayed just one night, and I did quite a bit of thinking. The things I want to talk about at the moment are pollinator plots, especially. I find it very difficult to have cultivated plants included in natural areas. I drive along highways in summer and I see yellow and white sweet clover, and I have to know that it's been planted on the roadside. It's a legume, so it is in effect a self-organized fertilizer. It can be mown 8 times a year, and it loves it. So the people who mow the edge just find it a fine place to be, and the pollinators like it. And but if you're going to encourage prairie preservation, and especially along roadsides, if I see black-eyed Susan or something that I know has been put into the roadside because the natural history looks a little daggy, then I'm disappointed, because that is our only leftover natural areas, and to have it sprinkled with cultivars is disappointing. If we can get farmers to do that, that's fine. But I'm very worried about the spirit and philosophy that's been proceeding in the Chicago area, especially. Often these little plots that haven't been developed are plots where there are native plants, and the soils have not been disturbed. To see them taken over by cultivated plants that are included in a prairie mix. It's okay, we're getting some prairie plants, but we're also invading what little prairie there is left. So I was thinking of that, and as we repassed on Thursday night, I was speaking to that one, and my question is, the Grand Prairie Friends is planting pollinator plots adjacent to forested areas. They're reconstruction of farmland, and that's a whole nother topic. How do you do that? And sure, you can do pollinators, but if you're trying to preserve prairie, then you'd need to think about the inclusion of cultivated plants. I'm also still very worried about wide trails. The wide trails between St. Joe and Danville are likely to be so wide that they take out the only prairie we have, the native soil and the native prairie that we have left. So I was talking to that a little. I was also interested in the projection. The Starved Rock lodge has a meeting place that is excellent in getting people together and doing things. But I find the projection of sound not something that natural history people are good at. Some people are very good at it. The lady who was doing philanthropy knew to speak into a microphone and speak into it at close range and with a loud voice. There's a tendency with males especially to think that they can speak loudly and clearly to 100 people. It's not so. By the time it gets to the end of the room, the beauty of the tops of the curves and swales of the sound are distorted. So you not only have to concentrate on how to listen, but you lose some of the energy and the beauty of the voice. To some extent, that depends on the leadership that is in control of the sound. To some extent, to a large extent, it's to the individuals who don't realize that that is an important goal, to be able to speak into a microphone. Certainly, the microphone may have to be specialized enough that is either very general or very pointed. But when I see a speaker with a microphone 2 feet away from his voice, I think of Mark Rubel next door, who's now teaching this sort of topic to musicians in Nashville, Tennessee. He is a specialist in this sort of thing, and I think we need to teach conservation people to learn about the technology of sound and also the technology of visuals. Sometimes the visual is difficult. The philanthropist was appalled at herself because she had, for a large audience, she had yellow on green, and you could hardly see it on the screen. So advertising design people can do a lot to improve that sort of presentation. It's interesting that mostly the microphone is a set microphone on a stand. That microphone can be released and you can take it to your mouth. But mostly that doesn't happen. Women are shorter and they're nearer to that outlet, and so they get to be heard fairly well. When you have a tall person that's maybe 6 feet high, they're a long way away from that set microphone. They need to take it out and eat it, and that doesn't happen because it's sort of invasive. It's not as friendly as if you speak to people directly. But we have to get over that. And it's also not good to be speaking to the microphone, but then you turn to look to the visual. And in opera, you have a microphone strapped fairly secretively to the singer, so that when they turn to act, the head turns with the microphone, or the microphone turns with the head. And whereas taking the microphone, even if you have taken it off of the hook, and use it as a pointer is another thing that happens very interestingly, or very commonly. In evaluation, I was tempted to suggest that they might like to invite Mark Rubel to explain why it is important to work with your sound and visual projections. So part of the meeting is to get to know who's who and what they do, and just to talk to each other. And over and over and over, I go to meetings like this, and the request is that people talk to each other. It has been that we could get 3 people together and get something done. And if you get 25 people together, you don't get it done as fast. But that is changing. Teamwork and group work is important, and those sort of meetings bring that sort of thing together. I would be remiss if I didn't say something about the trip to Starved Rock State Park. You're moving through the world's best soils. You're moving through total landscapes that were bought for 7 cents an acre or $2 an acre. I can't know which and why, but we've acquired land for very little, and often it's held very jealously, but there's a need for change in agriculture to make sure that we care for the soil and just don't exhaust it. There's sustainability, there's grassed waterways, there's surveys, there's a need to have application of chemicals by the nature of the soil, so that a sandy soil that has very little ion exchange capacity to hold chemicals will not need a whole lot of extra chemicals applied. Just run off into the water and down the Mississippi to a hypoxia zone or dead zone in the Gulf. We need the soils to be assessed. It happened originally. There was a guy named Cyril Hopkins, and Cyril Hopkins suggested early on, I don't know whether it was in the early 1900s, that soils should be mapped. And the federal government didn't really want to support this idea. He came to Illinois, and he was accepted as a soil map person. He had a formula. Cyril Hopkins Cafe Mighty Good covered most of the major minerals that were in the soils. So soil mapping was one of the early things that Illinois did as a state. Now that has to be extended to taking each soil and assessing it for the amount of sand and mineral capacity. You have to know about catenars so that you can have Drummer and Flanagan rich soils with high ion exchange capacity. Low down, and then you go up, and the moisture gradient changes as you go up over a moraine, and you get dry species to the top. but then a different retinue of soil microorganisms and bacteria. We need that sophistication, and we have a long way to go. So as I travel, I look and enjoy. I traveled up in bright sunlight, I came back in cloudy circumstances where you don't know quite the same way what the direction is. You have to use your GIS or maps, and there are 25 different ways to get to Starved Rock State Park, and you could, even in a Jeffersonian plat of east, south, north, south, east, and west, you can have to look for a way around a number. You have to know the numbers. You have to be prepared to be on small roads where traffic has to pass each other. So driving to and from Starved Rock is like a holiday vacation. Trees are wonderful. You can see the structure of the trees. You can see a forest. You can see a forest that has been manipulated so it only has one age of tree and no young ones to take over. You can see where cattle have been and eating up to a certain level of a tree, so it's pruned. There are waterways. There's ice and snowdrifts and wind and small rises that people who are used to mountains might not even recognize. So it's like a small vacation to go on a 200-mile trip and back. As I go, I look for other things. When I got to Strawn, which is a little place north of Gibson City, I know a welder there, so I stopped and said hi to the welder. He knows every little place where there's prairie on the railroad lines and back places. And I asked him, how is he going to transmit this information to another generation? He said, well, when I croak, my son will take over, and it will continue. And he has friends. He has a friend, Ron Miller, in fact, about 6 miles north of the forest, who's another of these people who know the landscape. We don't even know them as natural history people. Ringler is a welder, and 1,000 vehicles would go past his place not knowing his ability, but I'm sure the people in the region know him well in summer when a piece of a major equipment breaks and it needs to be welded. He was there with an organic farmer, and they were making a chair in the off season. They were making a vernacular chair. So I enjoyed just popping in to see the Ringler establishment. At Forest, there's a blue stem bank, and it is in other places. It's in Chinook or wherever, but it is interesting that it's taken on the name as a native plant. Right opposite the blue stem bank in Forest, there's a vernacular house. I suspect it's owned by an elderly person, because it doesn't look as neat and tidy as you might want. But there are trees that are made out of bottles. There are 4-foot daisies. There are little people spread around. So I was tempted to stop and take photographs of this vernacular art, because it really gives character to these little communities. And it's the sort of thing that where people will blink if they see it, if it's on a main drag, and back up to say, what the hell? And it's very, very interesting. At Forest, I also saw a wooden elevator sitting in amongst a bunch of more modern elevators. And I'm so aware that these elevators were made of big beams that you will never, never get again. Often they're burned down. We just lost one outside Hamilton Park to fire. It's almost a criminal problem. So I stopped the car, just drove into an accounting place where there was a parking spot, jumped out of my car, left the door open, and ran around to a spot where I could take a photograph of the wooden elevator. And very shortly, somebody came from the accounting place and was worried that I was not well. And that's very typical of traveling in these places. People are very friendly. They give you directions. They sometimes will lead you out of town or introduce, if they find out that you're interested in something, they will tell you where to find that sort of thing. So as I went through Dwight and Bud, there is a big church, and the highway was widened a little around it, and I thought that's good. But at Bud, I can remember going to a meeting there with Dr. Betts. Dr. Betts, who was a specialist in biology, who discovered that a lot of the prairie that has been saved is in little cemeteries. So his specialty was finding small cemeteries. But he was at Bud because there was a railroad line nearby, and it had been bought by people like Ron Miller from Lodge as a plot of prairie, and the adjacent farmers had objected and actually dug it up at one stage, and so this meeting was at the church to alert people to the value of this little piece of railroad bed. So as I go past some of these places, I'm familiar with enough to remind myself of progresses that have been made. When I came back home, I am an inveterate checker out of dumpsters to see what's there. And I opened one dumpster, and it was loaded with steel. And I started to pull the steel out. And it was a shelving, an official shelving. It must weigh about perhaps best part of 75 pounds. And that steel was destined to go to the landfill. One, you're going to take a whole bunch of gasoline to get it there, and two, it's going to occupy a lot of space at the landfill. I think we have a long way to go to convince people to recycle and to functionally reuse. I haven't put that unit together yet, but it seemed to me that it was intact and could be put together as a shelving device. We tend to put our second-hand shops and yards for accumulation of metal and glass and things out of town. We used to have a junkyard just a few hundred yards away, and it's gone now, and it will be replaced by a $250 million development for a hockey team, but for a venue that can be inviting people to come to this community for venues. But really, a lot of our waste fabric is coats and shirts and materials that can be reworn and reused, and so we need a sort of society that's more willing to do that, to provide the warehouse space that's needed to recycle items. There are some items that will take 6 months before someone will come in and say, wow, that's just what I need. But there's often a need to move and shake items by the week or by the month. So items have tags on them of color so that you can move them out to other places. As climate changes, so we change. There are X number of boots that were built for very cold climates. And I ask the recycle people, do they have agencies that are further north where these items that cost in the vicinity of $60 or even more, can they be recycled in a different way? And the answer is no, we don't have those sorts of facilities. But I think we should have. I'm interested in cardboard. The comic shop up the road receives cardboard in boxes that are very substantial, and they could be backloaded. But the company that brings the comic strips doesn't want to be involved, and the backloading is not there, and we need to change our attitudes to how we look at second-hand materials. I've got 4 minutes. I'm especially interested in micronutrients, and as we develop our farmland, I want to emphasize micronutrients because sometimes something like estrogen, you need very, very little of it to make a change. If you give a lot, it's a poison. Copper in very small amounts is essential, but if you have a lot of it, it's a poison. So I, as a result of some of these discussions at the Prairie State Conservation Coalition, I think of small amounts of hormones, and I think of teaching farmers how to be very careful about how they use chemicals. There's a tendency to provide antibiotics in a very general way, and so that allows bacteria and fungi to to become adapted to have resistance, so that even the medical people who are dealing with humans have a problem to know what to do when a biochemical becomes resistant, or the organisms that you're battling, like MERS or even the current virus. We have taken ourselves out of the opportunity to find the ways of saving the value of this biochemistry, which may be good for bacteria and fungi, but you also have to deal with viruses that are very different organisms, and we haven't done a lot of that, and the federal food and drug associations have not been very willing to check this out. We hope that will change.